Deep in the jungles of India, a troop of soldiers uncover a bizarre secret the jungle has kept tucked away. However, it's not what you think. In fact, this episode is going to take you on an emotional roller coaster of ups and downs that you're probably not expecting. Most disturbingly, this entire story has been thoroughly documented and is not the only one of its kind. You won't want to miss this one. Back in 1920, Joseph Amrito Lao Singh found himself bushwhacking through some of the densest and thickest jungles in India. Joseph was traveling along with 30 other men as he traversed and faced the dangers of the jungle, all in order to do one task: spread the gospel of Jesus. Having just been ordained 8 years earlier, his mission was to visit the region's most isolated communities, even through some of the most dangerous areas. Keep in mind that the jungles in India are extremely untamed and there is danger lurking around every corner. And as a matter of fact, in his party of 30 men, some of them were drummers, and their sole purpose was to try and make noise and keep dangerous animals away, mainly those big Bengal tigers. Now, it was during this time that him and his party would make their way all around West Bengal. And then, in 1920, things take place. At this point, they had found themselves in the jungles around Midnapore while looking for newer communities to evangelize. And it was here they traveled to a very small border town known as Godamuri. And it was here that Joseph encountered a man named Chunarem that was kind enough to allow him and his missionaries to take refuge in his own cowshed. However, while his warmth and hospitality were wonderful, he had a shocking story to tell them. He explained to Joseph and his party that he and the other villagers had been terrified to traverse the jungles after sunset. Joseph did his best to press for details and to find out why he was so terrified. Maybe it was because of tigers, maybe it was because of other unseen predators lurking about the jungle. But what he told them was something Joseph was not expecting. Chunarem described in detail this thing in the jungle that was hideous, a supernatural predator of some kind. It could be seen at dusk, and that about 7 miles away from the village was where it dwelt. He then begged Joseph and his party to please get rid of this thing. Well, fast forward a couple of days, and around September 24th at about dusk, Joseph was hanging out at the edge of town, and he was just trying to gather more information about this so-called paranormal predator. And after trying and trying, he couldn't really get much more info, and he just began to suspect that this whole thing was just some elaborate tall tale. Very soon, he would learn that this was far from a tall tale. Upon returning back to the village, Joseph would encounter this same story yet again, but from another person who acted far more afraid. He was then informed that there were multiple families ready to pack up and leave if something was not done about this predator lurking at the edge of town. Some of the villagers were terrified, and something was causing this. Joseph knew that in order to spread the word of God to this village, he had to get down to the bottom of this problem and figure out what was lurking outside the village. Was it an exceptionally large tiger? Was it perhaps a trick of the light that was scaring people? Or perhaps maybe it was my beard. Regardless of what it was, Joseph was adamant about figuring this out. So from here, he came up with a plan. He would take both his men and the villagers in a quick construction project and then erect a large hunting blind near a big tree. The location of this hunting blind was going to be constructed no more than 100 yards away from where this predator was most often seen. This would give him all the advantage he would ever need to identify what he was up against. And Joseph wasn't just armed with the word of God. Him and his missionaries were conducting their nightly vigils fully armed to the teeth. They were ready for action. Now, around 2 weeks later, construction was finally complete, and Joseph was able to reach the top of the platform to get a much better lay of the land around him. And as he's up there, he was able to clearly see the spot that this predator was supposed to lurk. Now, a lot of sightings and activity seem to focus around one specific area, where there was this enormous anthill. Keep in mind that ant mounds in jungle regions can get absolutely gigantic, and the one he was looking at was so large and broad at the base that there are actually 7 clear and defined holes that lead underground. Apparently, this is the area where, as locals would be passing by on their trips to the jungle and other local marketplaces, that this predator would pop out of the hole and terrify them. And this is because the path that led alongside the anthill was the main way of leaving town. Now, this whole game of waiting and watching went on for several weeks without anything turning up until October 9th of 1920. Around 5 p.m. in the evening, Joseph and several other men sat up on top of the hunting tower just waiting and watching like they had the previous couple weeks. Suddenly, Joseph and his men spot something moving, and whatever it is coming out of one of the tunnels of the anthill, and it's large. And as Joseph gets a closer look, he realizes that while it is a predator and fearsome to some, it's not exactly what he thought it was. What he's looking at, it's a wolf. And so Joseph is confused but continues to watch, and he sees 2 other wolves around the same size slide out of the tunnels and off into the darkness, and they are followed by a pair of cubs. Now, keep in mind before we go any further that wolves in this region, specifically west of Bengal, are fairly common. And when you're dealing with an anthill of this size, it is more than large enough to accommodate an entire wolf pack. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would a village be terrified of a couple of wolves? There's something more to this going on than meets the eye. Something paranormal, perhaps. Maybe not. But just as Joseph finished that thought and he's trying to make sense of this confusing sight, something else climbed out of the tunnels that answered all of his questions. He couldn't believe his eyes because whatever this was clearly was not a wolf at all, but something else entirely. However, before I share with you in detail what he saw, there is a horrible twist that comes later. What he saw climbing out of the tunnel looked somewhat like a human being, but it was hideous. He could see that it had hands, feet, and a body like a human, but the head was a big ball of something covering the shoulders and the upper portion of the bust, leaving only a sharp contour of the face visible. Then, right behind it, came another, but smaller in size. Their eyes were bright and piercing, unlike that of a person's, and both these creatures went off and followed the other wolf cubs, both running on all fours. Now, not only was Joseph on edge from seeing this, but his men were also spooked, and they began to raise their rifles to aim. But thinking quickly, Joseph diffused the situation, told them to stand down. There was just something in his gut that explained to him that this isn't right. There's a better course of action. And after peering through the binoculars, both Joseph and his men agreed that whatever they had saw looked far too close to a human being to kill it. This is where the story gets pretty crazy. Now, in order to verify what it is they saw and what they think it was, they decide to stay another night. And just like clockwork, they see the same creatures again. Now that he knows they for sure exist and they are definitely real, he has to find some way to get rid of them because they're causing so much distress to this village. So Joseph comes up with another plan. He hires some people from another village far away where they haven't heard about this predator at all. And because they aren't afraid, they all agree to come out to the ant mound with Joseph and the other missionaries with spades and shovels to break it apart. It took Joseph about a week to go off and gather these men, but once he was ready, he began to execute his plan perfectly. On October 17th, 1920, all the hired workers began chopping away at the gigantic anthill, and it didn't take long before the wolves bolted. The first one ran off into the jungle, the second one did the same thing, but the third wolf, the one that Joseph later identified as the mother, stood her ground. She snarled, she leapt at the workers, ready to defend whatever remained inside the deepest part of the den. The workers had no choice but to kill her. After hours upon hours of back-breaking work, Joseph and all of his armed men finally reached the heart of the wolf den. And here, folks, is where the twist comes in. These men couldn't believe their eyes because what they found left everyone speechless. This was the secret the jungle held. There, curled up in a ball, was a pair of wolf pups. But along with them were the two creatures that had been spotted by not only this village, but Joseph and all of his men. However, now that they could be seen in the light of day, their true identity was revealed. These were human children. One was older, around 8 years old, and the other no more than 18 months. They were both girls. And at this point, all the men were in complete shock because nobody quite understood how they ended up in these living conditions. But you've heard the saying, you've seen the Jungle Book. And since that story was written 26 years earlier, some of the men might have read it by then as well. But here it is, in the flesh, staring back at them. Yes, folks, these girls had been raised by wolves. The girls were rescued and taken back to the village where they were cleaned and their hair was cut. Then the girls traveled with Joseph to an orphanage about 75 miles away in Midnapore. When Joseph wasn't actively pursuing missionary work, he was the rector at this orphanage. A rector is typically the head or director responsible for overseeing the overall management and operation. On November 4th, 1920, Joseph and the two girls arrived in the city, and it was here that he would give them names. The younger of the two he named Amala, while the older girl named Kamala. The girls would continue to receive treatment for their wounds and sores and all the other various injuries that they had received during their tenure in the jungle. But folks, our story doesn't end here. It has an interesting twist. Both girls had been well fed when they had been rescued, but were now starting to show signs of malnutrition in captivity. It was apparent that they were terrified. They had no experience whatsoever being around other human beings. Both the girls began to quickly recover, but the psychological wounds healed much more slowly. The girls had not only been living with the wolves, but they continued to act like the wolves after being brought to the orphanage. And what's truly fascinating about this case is that under these extreme living conditions, both of them seem to have gained heightened senses of hearing and smelling. For example, neither of them seemed bothered by extreme heat or cold, and they also appeared to be able to see in the dark. More on that in a minute. In one instance, Joseph noted that Kamala seemed able to smell an animal being butchered 70 yards away in the kitchen. The moment the cooks began cutting, she raced to try and snatch a piece. Otherwise, they snapped at anyone who approached them with cooked food, which they refused to eat. But raw meat, on the other hand, was quickly gobbled up, especially if it was placed in a bowl on the ground. Even the way they ate was just like a dog. They would lower their mouths to the plate just the way a dog would consume solid foods. Any liquids like water or milk, they would just lap it like a puppy. Also interesting was the fact that both girls rejected having any clothing on their bodies. They simply tore any clothing to shreds. They not only hated the way it felt, but the clothes clearly restricted their movement. Remember that both of these girls moved around pretty well on all fours, and as a result, their knees and palms were covered in thick calluses. And neither girl said a single word, besides growling. And the only other sound the girls would make was when they would howl at night, calling to the other wolves beyond the borders of the city. During the day, they would mostly sleep and avoid the sunlight, and just stare for long hours on end at the wall, doing nothing. Joseph realized the severe condition these girls were in and knew he had a lot of work to do. And so he began to do his best to try and rehabilitate these girls. Many thought they were beyond hope, that their humanity was lost forever, but one woman, a nurse at the orphanage, refused to give up hope. Mrs. Singh. She was determined to connect with the girls, to draw out the human inside of them, and she started by sitting with them for hours, talking gently, even as the girls shied away. Weeks would pass with no progress. Then Mrs. Singh had an idea. She would bring in babies from the orphanage and talked and played with them. As Kamala and Amala watched from a distance, slowly they would creep closer and they would be intrigued by the sounds of Mrs. Singh handing out biscuits and food. It was actually the first sign of a breakthrough. Now, over many months, Mrs. Singh would use food to build trust with the girls. With each biscuit and cup of milk, The girls inched further out of their wild world. But the road to recovery was of course very long, and the girls still preferred the company of dogs to humans. They had to be coaxed to wear clothes, to eat with their hands. Even the simplest human behaviors were so foreign to them. And every day before dawn, Mrs. Singh would massage the girls with oil, just really trying to spend time with them, and gradually, the girls stopped resisting her care. And it was a sign that deep down, they did crave human connection, that the wild hadn't snuffed out the human element inside of them completely. Interestingly, Joseph even noted that the girls' facial features seemed to adapt to a life with the wolves. His observation is that they had prominent differences. For example, the formation of jawbones was raised and high, like the modification of the hand and feet. The jaws also had undergone some sort of change in the chewing of bones and constant biting at the meat attached. When they moved their jaws and chewing, the upper and lower jawbones appeared to part and close visibly, unlike human jaws. He even went on and described how their eyes were what he believed to be an adaptation. During the day, they looked as if they were heavy with sleep, but after 12 o'clock at night, they had this strange blue glare, similar to that of a cat or dog in the dark. And when you saw this glare, you were not able to see anything round about them but these two blue powerful lights. Now, I know this sounds far-fetched, but similar things have been observed in other mammals. For example, a domesticated pig that escapes into the wilderness actually starts reverting back to its natural state of being a wild boar. Scientists have observed that a pig released from captivity can quickly grow full tusks, and the color and thickness of their coats changes as well. There is even some evidence that the shape of their skulls change, although these sorts of physical changes haven't been documented in humans. We don't often get the chance to observe human beings raised by animals all that often. However, this story still has a few more twists and turns. In 1921, just as progress was being made, tragedy struck. Amala fell deathly ill with a kidney infection. For days, she lay unconscious, barely breathing, and Kamala kept vigil by her side, trying in vain to rouse her. Sadly, Amala passed away at no older than 2 years old. Kamala was understandably inconsolable. She searched every corner of the orphanage as if Amala might be hiding somewhere. She was gone. Without her, Kamala retreated into herself. She stopped eating, stopped responding to Miss Singh's voice. It was like she had lost her anchor to the human world. But Mrs. Singh refused to lose hope, and she spent even more time with Kamala, talking to her, holding her, willing her back to life. And slowly, over time, she began to come back. She began to play with the other children and imitated their sounds and gestures, and as the years would go on in this orphanage, she eventually became socialized enough to tolerate other human beings and was partially house-trained. In fact, she would walk upright from time to time, but always dropped to all fours whenever she needed to get somewhere fast. She even managed to learn a few simple words. Tragically, in 1929, Kamala succumbed to tuberculosis, just 8 years after she had been rescued. As much as this story has probably tugged on all of your heartstrings, this sort of thing has been well documented. Even over the centuries, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of reports where children were abandoned in some way, shape, or form, only to be raised by animals. Researchers call them feral children. One of the earliest and most famous examples comes from ancient Rome, where its founders were taken in by wolves. In the years since, there have been well-documented cases of children raised not just by wolves, but also dogs, cattle, sheep, goats, and bears. In the case of carnivores, the idea that these children would not only survive, but thrive among these animals is pretty wild, and that has led to a lot of skepticism. Unfortunately, the account of Amala, Kamala, and Joseph Amrito Lao Singh has been criticized in recent years. Despite being witnessed by others and plenty of accompanying photographic evidence, some scholars believe that Joseph's story might have embellished the girl's original discovery. As it turns out, some of the best cases where animals raised human beings are also most recent. Where Amala and Kamala died long ago, Other people are still alive today who swear that they spent years with their non-human families. An excellent example of this is John Sebunya of Uganda. Today, John is 40, but as a young boy, he swears that he spent his formative years in the company of a troop of vervet monkeys. You see, when he was just 4 years old, John witnessed his mother's horrific murder at the hands of his own father. Instead of entering the custody of the government, he fled into the wilderness and spent 2 years living with the monkeys. He says they taught him how to swing through the trees and forage for food and water. They also protected him. John even said that he grew fur in odd parts of his body during his time with them. Well, eventually, John was spotted accompanying his monkey family on a nighttime food raid in a local village. Soon after, he was found in the jungle. When he returned to civilization, John could barely speak, but by 2012, he had successfully rehabilitated and participated twice in the Ugandan Special Olympics. And now, despite being so well acclimated to living with people, John has never lost his special connection with the vervet monkeys. In fact, a 1999 documentary showcased how John not only seems at home among the monkeys, but still has the ability to communicate with them much better than anyone else in his village. But John isn't the only man who grew up with monkeys in the jungles of Africa. In fact, one of the best documented modern cases occurred in the 80s. And keep in mind that this decade was a very turbulent time for Uganda. The country was in the throes of an intense civil war, which meant that a lot of the jungles were patrolled by military teams, and there was just a lot of fighting and death and chaos. One of the teams deployed by the National Resistance Army would stumble on a troop of these monkeys in '85. And coming across a troop of monkeys isn't exactly interesting. But there is something different about this one. Crouching among the tiny primates was a human being. In fact, it was a small boy, no more than 6. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They immediately tried to rescue the child, but found that shooing away the monkeys proved difficult. The entire time, one of them held the child to her chest to protect him. The monkeys put up a fight, but were eventually dispersed. After taking the boy into their custody, soldiers were surprised to see that he could not smile, nor could he walk. He only jumped from squat to squat just like a monkey. He couldn't speak either. The soldiers said that he just howled like the monkeys had, and he struggled to properly use the bathroom. No one knows exactly how the boy wound up in the jungle, nor how long he was with the monkeys. Given that he was so young, it couldn't have been very long. But the first few years of human development are really important. Since then, he has struggled to fully adapt to human society. The boy was eventually given the name of Robert Mayanja. No one knows for certain what his history is, and the going theory is that he was born in the town of Luwero in 1979. His family apparently died during the war in 1982, and that means that he spent around 3 years in the jungle surviving on berries, fruits, and other things that he saw the monkeys eating. On July 5th, 1991, Robert was taken in by a community of Lurks, an organization that provides occupational therapy to developmentally disabled young adults and children. They designated the day of his arrival as his birthday. Well, as of 2013, Robert was doing much better, but still had a ways to go. He couldn't dress himself, but did cooperate when helped. He also mastered using a bathroom, but some hurdles still remained. He's still quite shy around strangers, and he never quite learned to walk like the rest of us. He still kind of slightly hunches when he walks and can sometimes be seen picking grass from the ground to eat. Although he's never learned to talk, he does manage to communicate through a variety of sounds conveying his emotions. In fact, and humorously, director of the Lurks community, Monica Ngao, gave some advice to people who meet Robert for the very first time. That you shouldn't run, he just wants to hug you. It is his way of greeting and showing love. Robert greets with the language he knows best, which is a powerful hug. And due to his mental disability, he still has to learn about his environment. He needs love and care from us because sometimes we act as his eyes and hands. You know, Robert's story is very important. It reminds us that, at the end of the day, these people raised by animals are just that, people. People who need and deserve our compassion and help. Although you aren't likely to run into someone on the street who was raised by wolves, You will meet people with different backgrounds and disabilities who need your help. It doesn't have to be a huge donation to a charity. It can be a few moments of compassion. That's all it takes. Normally, this is where I'd ask you if you think these stories are true, but they clearly are. So instead, I'll ask you a different question. Were these children raised by animals or just living alongside them? Because it's a crucial distinction for Dr. Douglas Canlin, who has worked with primates for over 40 years and is the author of the book Feral Children and Clever Animals. He would say this:
I think we're dealing with here some childhood memories that, like all childhood memories, become elaborated over time. I think he did spend much time with monkey troops. I think he did find food that they cast aside. He may well assume that the animals themselves had done the fashioning. So, when you ask, was this person raised by monkeys? I prefer to say he was raised to some degree with monkeys. But I don't believe the monkeys reared him, in the usual sense of the word.
And because you guys have all made it this far to the video, I want you to comment down below "to the wolves." So that way I know who made it to the very end and who didn't. And if you guys like content like this, where we dive into strange cases and stories of the mysterious and the supernatural, then go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.